Thanks everyone for joining us today. I would like to formally welcome you to Climate Change Costs to Ports and Waterways, a webinar hosted by PIANC USA, the United States section of the World Association for Waterborne Transport Infrastructure. Now, before we get into today's topic, I'll be taking a moment to cover a few housekeeping items, beginning with our webinar platform, Teams. So from the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, you can mute and unmute your line. You can also raise and lower your hand and interact non-verbally via reactions. And we encourage you to use the chat panel to send in your questions or comments. We will be addressing comments throughout today's webinar, so don't hesitate, drop it into the chat panel and we'll address it as we can. By viewing this webinar, you are eligible to earn 1 professional development hour, and we'll share a link and a password to retrieve your PDH certificate at the end of today's webinar. And if you have to duck out early, don't worry. A recording of today's event will be posted to PIANC USA's YouTube channel and will be emailed to you after today's event. Now onto our presenter. Dr. Jeremy Giovando is a research civil engineer for the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center, and we are grateful to have him join us today as a representative of PIANC's Permanent Task Group on Climate Change. With that, I'll hand things off to Dr. Giovando. Dr. Giovando, whenever you're ready, go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, thank you. Can you see that okay?
Not yet.
This is
There we go.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, let's get started. Thank you very much for that introduction, Teresa. I appreciate it. Really like the opportunity to be able to share with you some of the information that is being developed from the Permanent Task Group on Climate Change. And specifically, this is technical note 2, so climate change costs to ports and waterways. And, before we get started, I guess I'd like to recognize the chair of the Permanent Task Group, Jan Brook, helped develop a lot of the content in these slides, as well as she was the primary lead for the report. Just would like to recognize her contributions too. So what is technical note 2? And I want to start with a summary first, just in case people do have to duck out early, and also to make you understand where we're headed with this. So technical note 2, it is not a prescriptive document. Rather, it intends to facilitate an understanding of the consequences of inaction. And so this inaction would be related to adaptation for climate change. And the other thing that we want to emphasize is the information in technical note 2 is meant to help ports and waterway operators and managers understand what needs to be investigated, what needs to be assessed, and then potentially what needs to be quantified to make the business case for climate adaptation. And so, of course, one of the key sort of quantifications are the costs and benefits associated with the investment for climate adaptation and resilience interventions. That is discussed in technical note 2. And really the aim of this document and this report is to support port owners, operators, and investors so that they can begin to develop and scope their own business case for making the investment for climate adaptation. So it's really to help facilitate that. So the next, I guess I'd like to just say is climate change is a business risk. And but before we get there, the next thing I want to mention is just provide everybody sort of a high-level overview of what do we mean by climate change, and perhaps this is old news to you, and perhaps this is something you've seen before. But in the U.S., based on the Fifth National Climate Assessment, we have evidence of sea level trends, and specifically rising sea level trends, particularly along the East Coast and the Gulf. Perhaps a little more mixed along the West Coast, but in general, the trends are going up. Again, with annual precipitation and temperature, we do see patterns that have occurred just in the historical record. And with typically warmer conditions, particularly in the wintertime, precipitation has more variability as far as the trends we're seeing, but generally drying in the Southwest and increases in annual and seasonal precipitation in the Midwest and Northeast. What about the extremes? So again, from the Fifth National Climate Assessment, we see that the frequency of heavy precipitation events, particularly for the heaviest of days, is increasing. So the number of events are increasing based on the historical evidence. We also have trends across the continental U.S. with the 5-year maximum and the annual maximum precipitations also showing increases in the number of days for those. And so that's a pretty clear trend that we're seeing more heavy precipitation events. The changes in extreme hot and cold, those are a little more mixed. And so the number of hot days are increasing in the West and maybe not changing as much in the East. With the cold days, that's a little more consistent across much of the U.S., where we see that there are fewer days below freezing, and particularly there's an increase in warm nights, nights that are above 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So these are trends in sort of the extremes that have been observed based on the evidence in the National Climate Assessment. So other extreme events, and there are obviously lots of them. I just want to highlight two here that we have from different literature and analysis, and that's related to hurricanes and wildfires. So hurricanes, the frequency of those events, it's actually sort of a mixed signal on there. There's not clear evidence that the frequency is increasing, but there could be some data limitations associated with that. In contrast, wildfires, certainly the number of acres burned is increasing, and we've seen that for over the last 20 years as a clear upward trend with some interannual variability. But the idea is that each year more and more acreage in the United States is burned through wildfire. So what's the cost of these events? And I think this is the key takeaway of any of this is, regardless of whether the data, we can detect a signal in a specific type of extreme event, the data related to billion-dollar disasters is very clear. And so if you look at the per capita cost from 1980 through current, there's a clear upward trend of increased costs every year due to these disasters and events, and in almost every category of the different types of events are increasing. And these are real consequences and real costs that are borne here in the United States based on these natural disasters. The big key question that we often get is, how much is climate change impacting these extreme events? Because we've always had extreme weather, but what is the climate actually doing, and what sort of attribution can we put towards that? And in recent years, there's been a lot of work toward this, and it's pretty clear that a lot of these extreme events were enhanced with climate change. And so I think that's the key takeaway, is that these weather and extreme storms, et cetera, are being enhanced with the changing climate. And so that's something that we need to consider. So since we know that we have severe weather and extreme events, and those are being compounded with the changes in annual temperature, precipitation, as well as sea level, so those are being compounded on each other, which presents a unique issue for ports and waterways. So we know ports are vulnerable to flooding, wind, wave action, extreme heat. And as these events get more common, we're going to exceed those critical operational thresholds more often, and that's going to be problematic. And we also have the issue of high and low flows, which reduce the navigability of and disruption for inland waterways. And we know that ports are vital transportation nodes. So the direct connections that they have, but also the cascading effects. So any impacts to a port or waterway can quickly cascade to other transportation networks, energy or water supply or telecommunications, also wider supply chains. So very few ports and waterways will be unaffected from climate. And so the idea here is that we are urging port operators and owners to invest in strengthening and adapting. So figure 1 from technical report 2, it is a helpful sort of starting point. And what we have across the top are different activities that may be occurring in the port. And as you move down, you'll see the climate variables or parameters that are going to be related to that activity, and then the potential impacts from climate change. So this is a great starting point for understanding the connections between activities and the potential impacts that the climate may have on them. So what are the consequences of climate change? I think this is kind of the important question that we wanted to bring out with this particular report. So there were 2 sector surveys that were completed. So one was taken by the United Nations, and the other was through the Navigating a Changing Climate, the NAV Climate. And both of these surveys were intended to understand if ports and waterway owners and operators are experiencing any impacts due to changes in extreme events that are consistent with what climate projections might say are going to happen. And so often the extreme winds and waves, rainfall events, those were mentioned very often in these surveys. And when they were asked to quantify the damage and cleanup costs, there was quite a bit of range, from less than 100,000 to up to 10 million. In addition, we do reference some literature that shows specific events that costs exceeded 10 million for cleanup and damages. But again, these surveys had sort of limited categories when it came to that. So when you look at all the ports that responded to the NAV climate survey, about a third of them said that the post-event cleanup and damage repair were significant or critical. So this is really important especially for smaller ports, either in developing countries or those that just have resource constraints. Even dealing with a damage of $100,000 can represent a significant challenge. The other component that the survey covered and the respondents, provided information about were delays and disruptions to their operations. And so about a quarter of the respondents said that the delays and disruptions equated to greater than $100,000, but there was ranges from $1 million to more than 10 million. And so I think that's really critical to understand. There you have the direct impacts as well as just the potential impacts due to the disruption of operations. And so nearly half of all of the respondents described these delays and disruptions as significant or critical. So that's something that, this is information coming directly from the sector on what they're experiencing. So I just throw in a few examples here of.
And Dr. Giovando, before we
Yes.
get into the specific examples, we do have a question in the chat panel.
Okay.
I think about the previous slide. Was that the total number of survey respondents?
Maybe I'm not quite understanding total number on which statement.
Yeah, I think the question might be how many folks responded to these sector surveys?
Okay. Yes. So there were 2 different surveys, and so there were different numbers. I believe the NAV climate was around 60, and the UN was close, maybe around 45 or 50, but I don't recall the exact numbers off the top of my head.
Okay, that works. Sounds like
Okay.
that answers the question. Thank you, Dr. Giovando.
Yeah. So here's an example of extreme wind damage. And obviously this is going to cost, have costs associated with that, with the disruption. Here's an example of low water. This has significant impacts on navigability as well as just the operations of the ports. So these are just real, recent examples of what we were talking about previously. Here's another potential disruption due to climate. As we see warmer temperatures, both air and water, we see this enhanced vegetation growth, even establishment of invasive species, which can have significant impacts on the operations and maintenance for the ports and waterways. So now let's quickly cover the climate guidance that is available through PIANC. I'm not sure if everyone is aware, but I thought it'd be worthwhile to at least go through this. So one of the foundational reports, Workgroup 178, it covers, there's a lot of information in there. It covers, the concepts between how planning for climate adaptation can occur in ports and inland waterways. It's a very comprehensive document and well worth it, and is a great starting point. So that was released in 2020. In 2022, we released Technical Note 1, which focuses on climate uncertainties and how to include those in your planning. And so that's often a question that people have. So we try to address that as best we could in Technical Note 1. Task Group 3 report, it's more general for waterborne transport, ports and waterways, but it's basically linking climate change drivers to the impacts. And so there's certainly a lot here related to inland navigation and ports, but it's an update from a 2008 PIANC Task Group 3 effort that tried to understand the connections between climate change and the impacts. Finally, I just want to highlight Workgroup 249, which is expected to be completed in 2025. This is actually a workgroup that's diving deeper into adaptation measures for inland waterways and how those can be used to address different climate impacts. So this is, I think, going to have a lot of really useful information and hopefully be something that you all can utilize in your planning process. So Technical Note 2, so the connection we have here is that Workgroup 178 identified two main barriers to adaptation implementation. One was the uncertainties associated with climate change, which we tried to address in Technical Note 1, and then the business case for investment, which we're addressing in Technical Note 2. And so the idea is that Technical Note 2 will support the port and waterway owners and operators by helping facilitating understanding of the consequences of inaction, the types of analysis that can be used to quantify the potential benefits of adaptation, as well as helping understand the range of other reasons that may be helpful when making the business case on why there should be an investment. So really, these are the objectives of Technical Note 2. What are the consequences of inaction? So I've said that here a couple times, but I think it's good if we cover it specifically. So inaction has a cost, especially within the context of a transient or changing climate. And these costs can be quite significant. And so when we say inaction, we're not necessarily specifically, pointing out you need to go build something or construct a new piece of, infrastructure. But what, inaction can include or does include is just the failure to maintain the existing infrastructure and systems, or potentially the failure to monitor that infrastructure and understand the trends or projections for the climate variables that will impact your operations. And then finally, it can, inaction can also include just the lack of assessing risks or developing any sort of plan. And so, one thing we want to be totally clear in what the permanent task group intended with this report is to emphasize that climate adaptation is not a charitable act. This is not something that you do just because it is only because it's the right thing to do, but it ensures that the operations and sustainability of these ports and facilities and waterways continues even in the face of the climate crisis. So I think it's just important to understand that context that really this is about addressing the risks associated with the climate that we're going to face here, we face now and into the future. And I want to emphasize the consequences of inaction because I think it's easier to relate numbers. But here's table 5 out of our report. Talks about the relative risk per square meter of port area. So these are numbers from Verschuur et al. 2023, and I like to just highlight that the high income countries an average of $23 per square meter, but let's look at the range. That could be upwards of 300 or more dollars per square meter. So when you start adding up what the risk is for your facility, consider that this can be quite a broad range of potential impacts depending on what sort of climate change your region is experiencing. So now what are the adaptation barriers and motivators that we typically hear about? So the limiting factors are, first of all, information. So the lack of climate literacy and data. Now, I will say that over the last decade, the amount of data has gone up exponentially, and there's a lot of information, but trying to understand how to utilize that information, make it actionable, that's still, I think, a severe limitation to adapting and creating these sort of plans. Financing, of course, if you have trouble finding sources of capital to implement any sort of measures, that can be a challenge. Business models and planning horizons. So this is something we've noted in the report, and that is if your business model is a 5 to 10 year planning horizon, but your infrastructure is designed to last for 100 years, you're just continually focused on sort of near-term activities that may have more immediate priorities, and they can take precedence over planning for long-term climate change. The other thing is the consistent definitions. So when we often run into challenges when we look at metrics or standards, and the idea of creating a resilient investment still remains somewhat elusive when we're talking about making these adaptation plans and the investments in your facilities. And then finally, often it's a question of timing for change. So when and how much should a facility do in planning for adaptation, because it's often really challenging to say especially some of these transformational changes, exactly when they should be implemented. And so I think that's can be often a limiting factor for action. So on the converse side, the factors for motivating adaptation, I think the most obvious one is when there is a large event or an extreme condition that can often spur people to want to do something. Regulatory compliance, that can certainly be something that is important for motivating these adaptation actions. And then, of course, good practices. And so you reduce risk, and then you want to look at the key performance indicators. And so those are things that are existing motivators that often port and waterway managers think about. Some of the emerging ones are ones that are more evolving here recently. Insurance, especially recently, is definitely looking at risks related to climate. And so being able to get insurance and have affordable premiums is going to be a concern when considering how climate is going to impact your facility or your port. And then along with that, you have the finance sector, which of course they always look at risks, and now climate is certainly part of that portfolio of risks. And so I think, really the climate related financial risk disclosure is going to be something that could potentially be a motivator, especially moving forward in the future. What we want to say and what we kind of put forward here in technical note 2 is that climate change is a business risk, but you can reduce that risk and get the benefits of adaptation through what we call the triple dividend. So the adaptation action itself avoids or reduces economic loss, which is key, but it can also bring positive gains from this risk reduction. So you not only can see protect your current operations, but perhaps it allows you to enhance your operations, especially given the more frequent occurrence of extreme events. And then also you can deliver the social and economic benefits or social environmental benefits that we talked about earlier, especially when these ports and waterways are so integral in supply chains and connections to the other transportation networks. The other idea is you have avoided damages. So you basically avoid the disruption related losses. And what we found is the triple dividend and losses avoided principles are not often or always used when talking about investment in the navigation sector. So we hope that this technical note 2 can help facilitate that by emphasizing how both of those can really help make the business case. But if we want to make the business case simply on benefits and costs, we did include this figure in our technical note. And so this essentially looks at the benefit to cost ratio for adapting to different risks. And what you can see is that in general, the benefit to cost ratio is almost nearly always greater than 1, and in some cases substantially greater than 1. So just think about that. It's if you're going to invest money into something and you want to get a benefit out of it, looking for adaptation measures against climate change will certainly be one that produces a benefit to cost ratio that can be useful. So how do we scope the business assessment? First, we want to quantify financial loss exposure. Basically, identify hazards in the different scenarios to the physical assets, the operations, and any lost revenue. So that's really important to quantify that financial loss exposure. Along with that, we want to define the acceptable levels of risk. And there's always going to be residual risk, but what are acceptable levels of that? And then we want to quantify and understand consequences of inaction. As we were talking about earlier, what is the potential cost to damages and repairs if I don't take any action at all? What about the disruption or the port closure costs? And then, of course, there are the other indirect or maybe even direct safety, societal, and environmental impacts that we mentioned earlier. That can, these can add up very quickly. So it's important to when doing this assessment, to quantify and understand the consequences of those. In addition, we want to quantify and understand the system level consequences. So this relates to that cascading failures idea of the interlinked systems. And then along with that, what are the social and economic implications for the local or even regional communities? Because they can be quite substantial. And then, just generally, what are the consequences of disruptions in the supply chain? And I think this is becoming something that people are thinking about quite a bit now, because we do have experience in the last few years with this. And the key here in the assessment is that the adaptation costs, there's potentially going to be a wide range. And so you want to explore the full range, because there are going to be the low cost or quick win options that maybe can be done relatively soon, that can at least give you a little more time to figure out the more substantial physical or technological options. And so again, we want to emphasize that these adaptation costs have a wide range, but thinking back to that slide with the benefits, the investment of looking at how to address the adaptation due to climate and increase your resilience certainly can be beneficial. The other part of the assessment process is considering access to affordable financing. What does that look like? What is the business continuity planning? So basically, can you get affordable insurance? And then again, the risk disclosures and what that might look like to secure investment. There might be regulatory requirements to understand, if there's penalties for failing to meet certain operating criteria. Also related to that are contractual implications. So do you have contracts that you have to meet? On the national target side, there's both the climate adaptation and then also mitigation potential for depending on your local jurisdiction. Those could be considerations in this assessment. You have corporate objectives, of course, and then, of course, if there are project authorization questions that require some information related to, climate resilience and adaptation, that should be included in this assessment. And then finally, I just want to mention there should also be some thought put into new business opportunities by investing in the infrastructure in the port or the waterway. What new opportunities might there be, as well as what sort of reputational gains can there be from that sort of investment? So those can be, looked at as, with a little more positive aspect of, instead of just what's my existing risk, what are the new opportunities for business, and how do we grow that with the investment related to climate. So figure 6 ties all these concepts together. So figure 6 from technical note 2. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to share with you, this diagram is just meant to help bring everything together and give you sort of a connected guidance on how to put together those assessments. And hopefully that's useful for you. So I just would like to wrap up with a few ideas here. And the key is, there is no one size fits all solution for making a business case, because really there's no one, single sort of design or one size fits all port or waterway. So each one obviously is going to have a unique solution. But, depending on the nature of the organization and its management, that's going to influence sort of the approach you take and the appropriateness of the different investment or the different adaptation measures and the investment that's needed to make those measures real. So some organizations are certainly going to respond to more financial institution requirements, while others, it might be government guidance or economic analysis. And then private sector operations will certainly be concerned with cash flow and revenue. So each port and waterway are going to have different concerns, but at the end of the day, nearly everybody's going to have competing priorities for limited resources. But that doesn't mean that the investment in climate adaptation, and at least the business case for it, can't be made. And so I think there's good information in technical note 2 to help get you started on this and help put the pieces together to really figure out how and what needs to be done to ensure that these ports, waterways, and other inland navigation infrastructure are resilient into the future. So
Dr.
I'd like to,
Giovando,
yes.
we do have a question on that, on where that investment is coming from. A participant has asked, does the port itself take on all of the risk, or are heavy port users like major industries or companies also funding climate resiliency projects at the ports that they use to mitigate the risks in their supply chains? And there's a second part to that question. How are users keeping the ports accountable?
So answer the first question first. We do touch on that in technical note 2, the investment. We don't go into it in great detail, but public-private partnerships certainly can play into that. Or if there are, it's just private capital based on the sort of operation. I mean, there are different ways that can certainly be addressed. And I think, again, it becomes a sort of port by port or facility by facility sort of answer on the best way to figure out how to finance that. And then the second question, would you mind repeating that, Teresa?
Yeah, the second part is, how are users keeping the ports accountable?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. I uh, we don't address that necessarily in this technical note. I would uh, say that that's an excellent question that I can't answer, and so I think it might be helpful to find members of PIANC that maybe can help answer that.
Okay, and that sounds like a great opportunity. If folks have thoughts on that, drop it into the chat panel. This is a good big group, and so it's always good to crowdsource knowledge within our participants here. Um, we're entering the Q&A portion. We have a few other questions lined up, and I'm going to take over controls and share my screen once more. Okay. And Dr. Giovando, another question we received, what do you see as the ideal next steps for this material? For example, do you see ports using it in planning activities or for more work to be invested and turning it into an assessment product for ports to use?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what we intend is with the current guidance that PIANC has, the pieces are there for someone to assess their risk and then start to develop a plan on how to address that risk. And we we hope that what that means is that putting together a plan would then uh, lead to figuring out how to uh, finance that plan and then how to actually get it implemented and start that action of moving forward to make the facility or port or waterway more resilient. And so this is certainly geared toward the planning stage. Work group 249 is probably going to be more helpful for designers or people that are doing more of the technical work because that's directly talking about climate impacts and then measures to mitigate those. So I think that 249 will be more on the technical side, where everything that we have at this point is going to be more for the planning, developing a business case.
Mhm. And Dr. Giovando, it sounds like the bottom line is that climate change is a topic that PIANC is taking seriously, right? And continuing to address and consider and research and put out publications on that front in general. So there might also be more publications around the corner down the road that we don't have visibility into yet that could build on this, right?
And that's absolutely right. There's some terms of reference that have been approved can that may potentially help with addressing some of these. Other work groups that are ongoing are going to touch on different aspects of this, and so I think the short answer is yes. And certainly beyond just the guidance documents that I presented, there are other working groups that may have information that could be useful.
That's great. And we have one more question here, and I encourage folks to continue dropping questions into the chat panel. We have a few minutes left in today's webinar. For now, our next question is, what is the benefit that can be manifested through external stakeholders being brought together to characterize and agree upon priorities? Big question.
Yeah, that is a big question. I mean, just to put it most simply, the benefit is the continued operations of these facilities, which are obviously part of the transportation of goods and services around the world, and so basically keeping the economy moving, I think is definitely one of the key benefits. And in addition, I also think that another benefit is that there's opportunities, as we mentioned in the last few slides, to grow and look at new ways to enhance the sort of uh, I guess business associated with inland navigation and ports. So I think it's not only keeping what you have, but also looking toward the future of what there could be.
Mhm. Okay. Scott, let us know if that answered your question or if you want to double click on that a little bit further. For now, there are no more questions in the chat panel, so I'm going to take a moment to walk us through some of our closeout materials so that if folks would like to drop off the webinar, they can. And the first is, of course, as a participant, you're eligible to earn 1 professional development hour for your attendance. You can follow the link on the screen and that will be dropped in the chat panel and use the case-sensitive password, all lowercase climate, to get your customized PDH certificate. Again, that is the case-sensitive, all lowercase password, climate. Second, we value your feedback. You'll also find a link here on the screen and in the chat panel to a brief 5-question survey about today's event, and we would really appreciate your input. Okay, Dr. Giovando, we have one more question. Do you have or a few more, excuse me, a reference for running a benefit cost analysis for ports and waterways? I know FEMA has their toolkit, US DOT has their guidance, and the Corps has their guidance.
As far as references go, I guess we could compile some of those references. I don't. I guess I don't have the links handy, but yeah, it is challenging when doing these sort of benefit cost analysis. And I can certainly give the link to the source document that we presented in technical note 2. So that might, between all of those, that might give you at least some idea of what's out there as far as what's been published.
Yeah, I think that would be great. And following today's webinar, we're going to post this recording on YouTube, distribute it to participants, and we can add any additional information, links to those references in that final closeout email that will be going out in a few days as well. Okay, and we have, Dennis, we have your specific information, so we'll be sure to follow up with you individually. Another question that come in, does this technical note tie into green marine certification or other green shipping certifications?
It does not, but I think there's, if I'm not mistaken, there's at least one work group and potentially a couple of terms of reference that have been approved that may be related to that. So perhaps more to come as related to PIANC reports, but in this particular case, technical note 2, we don't dive into that.
Okay, that seems like a general statement for PIANC reports. There's always more to come. Always something in the works.
Yeah, I mean, these are big topics, and so trying to keep the report focused is always a challenge.
Yeah, understood. Okay, we have just a few minutes and no questions right now. I will put the call out one more time. If you have a question, drop it into the chat panel. But in the meantime, I do want to let you know about another upcoming PIANC USA event that we are particularly excited about, called Smart Rivers 2025. This event will be hosted in Memphis, Tennessee in September 2025 with a theme of celebrating the world's navigable rivers. Oops, my auto scroll pushed me forward there. Sorry about that. Registration is currently open and we will be accepting abstracts through the end of January. We hope you will join us at this exciting event. You can learn more at smartrivers2025.com. And with our last few minutes, we did receive one more question. What are your thoughts on military use of ports worldwide sharing usage? For example, security, size of vessels?
Maybe just for clarification, is that in the context of sharing costs for adaptation or just sharing the actual facility or using the facility?
Let's go with option number 1. James, if you'd like to clarify, you're welcome. But because this is about cost of adaptation generally, the answer is both.
Yeah. Good question. We certainly don't go into that in technical note 2. I think the idea is that climate change is going to impact nearly all ports and waterways. So that's kind of the overarching. Now, who's using those and the sort of cost sharing that could go on, I think that's going to be where there's going to have to be some creativity, and that certainly can vary based on jurisdiction or nation, and so those are going to be really difficult questions, but I think important ones about how to figure out how to accelerate these adaptation actions. So I don't have a good answer for you other than I think that's something that should be considered.
Okay. James, let us know if that answers your question, or again, if you want to double click on that topic. We are at the end time for today's webinar, so we and our presenter have a little bit of flexibility. We have a few more questions and we'll stay on to answer those. But if you blocked just 45 minutes, this is your cue. Go to your next meeting. And thanks so much for joining us. Okay, Dr. Giovando, another question that's come in. How is this framework presented to decision makers who deny climate change? And what key messages would you recommend for that type of communication?
Yeah. So I think if we go back to the slide where the evidence of extreme events causing damages is there, right? The $1 billion events, that data is there. That's happening. And so those are from, extreme weather events, and those weather events are continuing to occur and obviously causing more damage. So from that perspective alone, even if you're not considering the fact that climate change is enhancing or potentially enhancing a lot of those, the idea is that you know creating more resilience and investing in your facility is going to be worthwhile just to mitigate having $1 billion sort of event occur. And I think that's sort of a foundational issue that everybody can hopefully get behind and understand. As far as how to communicate that, I mean, the surveys that we present, and I think this is what's really important, is because you have the academic literature, the scientific literature, and certainly that's fairly consistent on what's going on. But those surveys that we present in Technical Note 2, I mean, that's feedback directly from port owners and operators. That's not researchers giving that information. So they are seeing these impacts. And so, that in and of itself should be pretty powerful, because that's saying, well, look, uh, people are experiencing this already. And, even if it doesn't get worse in the future, that potential is still going to be there. So I think that could really help communicate what your question is related to.
Mhm. And folks will have access to these slides after today's webinar. So if you'd like to reference those, you can. And the Technical Note 2 is free to download on pianc.org/publications. So we can circulate that link as well. Another question that came in: as CERL is developing enterprise SMS and adding waterfronts as a domain, are you aware of how they are incorporating climate change as they develop inspections and costs for these facilities?
I don't have direct knowledge on that. I guess I'm sure others do, but I guess I don't have a lot of information on how or if they are including those costs in those facilities.
Okay. No worries. If other folks have information on the call, feel free to drop it in the chat panel. Another question: for U.S. inland waterways, who is looking at system-wide climate change risks rather than localized single port issues?
Uh, this is an important and good question, and I think um, certainly within the federal government, the Corps is very concerned with maintaining navigation in maintaining the waterways, as well as any sort of facilities associated with navigation. So the Corps is looking at this, and it's a big issue, and that's, I think, the challenge is there's a lot of these are very big issues, and they take time to sort of create the actionable science that federal agencies need in order to move forward. Others, DOT, and the entities associated with, like, managing ports and waterways. I'm sure, those non-governmental entities. I'm sure there's all kinds of others that are considering this, but I am most familiar with the Corps, and I guess we are trying to tackle this, but it is it's challenging for sure.
Okay, thanks for that answer. One more question. Do you have any records with reports of problems caused by severe storms where ships may have caused damage to the jetty or the pier infrastructure?
Hmm. Uh, the short answer is not at my fingertips. I mean, there's probably information out there, but I guess I don't have that. And we weren't in this particular effort. We weren't necessarily focused on uh, tracing back all the individual events that were reported in those surveys. So we were just using the survey information more to convey the information more generally. But I'm sure that each one of the ports probably have records of what was, what damage was caused and the sort of issues they had.
Okay. Okay, that does it in terms of questions that we have received. Dr. Giovando, I think we're ready to close things out. I'll pass the microphone back to you if you have any closing thoughts before we shut down the webinar.
Just thank you again. I appreciate the great questions, and I appreciate the opportunity to share this information. There'll be, more to come, like I mentioned, from the work group 249, and then also just a pitch for the permanent task group on climate change is meant to help all the commissions within PIANC look at how to answer questions related to climate change. So if one of the commissions has, a specific question, please reach out to the permanent task group and we can figure out either through more technical notes or whatever, we can help answer those. So I think just view that as sort of a resource for each of the commissions within PIANC.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. And I think that will do it for today. I will say thank you again to everyone for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.